David was a great king. The greatest king Israel had. And he was a great man of God too. We can see that in other places in our Bibles. So how did this happen? I was thinking about the Ten Commandments, and I reckon that David broke the last 5 all in one go in this account here, probably. If we go from the last commandment, the 10th, you shall not covet your neighbour's wife, etc., etc. Specifically, neighbour's wife mentioned. Covet meaning desire for yourself. Well, that's where all this started. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbour. Well, lie. Well, there's deceit here all through this account as we read it. You shall not steal. Well, ultimately he stole someone else's wife. You shall not commit adultery. Well, spot on that one. You shall not murder. God saw the death of Uriah as murder by David. We read that later. He was the one who arranged for it to happen. He broke all these commandments. And yet, we've had that description earlier of David as a man after God's own heart. A man whose heart was kind of in tune with God's. How did he go so badly wrong? Well, we'll maybe try and answer that in a moment. But of course, the point for us today is that if a man like David, with a faith like David's, can fall to temptation and go so badly wrong, then, hey, you and I can. That's for sure. I guess we knew that already. But temptation is really the subject for this talk. Temptation that leads into sin. James, in his letter in the New Testament, has a nice little couple of verses that talk about this progression that goes on. He says, in the wrong place. Each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Death is the end of the road. Maybe in more sense than one. Well, in this story, literally, death of Uriah was the end of the road here. Death, perhaps most importantly, in terms of spiritual death, separation from God. We know that simple truth. Sin separates us from God. It's like a death. We're going to think about this process of one thing leading to another, about the consequences of when it does. The particular example here is to do with sexual sin, sexual immorality, specifically adultery, sex with somebody else's husband or wife. That's what it is, as simple as that. Forbidden very expressly in the commandments. But the Bible as a whole, of course, as we know, talks a lot about sexual immorality and the proper place of sex within marriage. That's one kind of temptation that we face, but there are many others, of course. Spoke about them earlier on in the service. Temptation to take or to keep things that aren't ours, and there's so many different ways in which that kind of raises its head, isn't there? Particularly in this age of technology, when we can acquire things in all kinds of ways with gadgets that we have. Tax evasion, there's another area. The perks, as we call them, we get at work maybe. All sorts of ways in which we can take and keep things that aren't ours. Temptation to do that. Temptation to say or do things that are hurtful to others, whether in their presence or not. Gossip, that's a temptation to speak about others in a hurtful way when they're not in our presence. That temptation not to do things that we know we ought to do, things that are good or helpful. Maybe the temptation not to own up when we know we're in the wrong. Maybe we're content to let somebody else take the blame. All kinds of temptation. I wonder which kind of temptation you struggle with most. What do you find yourself falling to? Things that, if you took time to think about it, you know are wrong, actually. But all the same, you find yourself doing it. Maybe there's things you're struggling with, even now in your life, finding hard to resist. I will spend a bit of time praying later. Maybe you can bring those things to God. But let's see what lessons we can learn from David. Are there lessons we can learn? Well, how and why did he fall to temptation? It's beautifully presented, this story. I mean, it's a pretty awful account, isn't it? But the way it's written is well, it's very powerful, but very subtle in places as well. The very first verse, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. I think there's a little bit of an indication here that something is amiss right at the start. David had not gone out to lead his men in battle as a king was expected to do, as he had done so many times in the past and won so many great victories. He seemed to have lost his appetite somehow for that. He was leaving it to others. But the point is, he was not doing what a king should do, meaning he wasn't doing the job that God had given him to do. The inference being, I think, that David's faith had gone off the boil a bit at this point. I think that's what made him more vulnerable to temptation. And it's the same for us, isn't it? You see, it's especially during those times when we've drifted away a little bit perhaps from God that we're likely to fall to temptation. When for some reason we've stopped striving to live day by day for God. When our faith is at a bit of a low ebb. Perhaps we've got out of that habit day by day of spending time with God and praying regularly. Then is the dangerous time. And of course there's nothing wrong in being tempted. We can't keep sinful thoughts out of our heads entirely. It's how we react to them that matters. David happened to catch sight of Bathsheba bathing. He wasn't intending for that to happen. He wasn't at fault for that. But he let his eyes linger a bit too long on Bathsheba. That's what happened. He could have taken his eyes away immediately, but he didn't. It reminded me of reading something that Rob Parsons wrote. I couldn't find it in a book I've got where I thought it was. Rob Parsons from Care for the Family, if you know, talking about affairs and how they begin. And he has something that stuck in my mind about, I think he called it the 5-second rule. You see somebody across the other side of a room at a function you're at and you're attracted to them. He says you've got 5 seconds to look somewhere else and not let your thoughts continue in that direction. David allowed thoughts to take root, thoughts about what might happen next. He sent somebody to find out more about this woman. And he was on the slippery slope downwards. Very reminiscent of Eve right at the beginning of the Bible. You know, that wonderful description of temptation and sin that fits so very well with most everything else that we fall to. The woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom. She took some and ate it. That's what happened here. She knew it was wrong. David knew it was wrong. Jesus talked, of course, about lustful desires being just as wrong as the act itself, didn't he? Because it's wrong in itself, but also because of what it leads to, what it can lead to. That's why pornography is such a big problem, isn't it? We're never looking at naked pictures of men and women without any other thoughts, not for aesthetic value. It's the thoughts that go along with it that are also wrong. And because it must have an effect, it can have an effect on the way we act as well, eventually. David wanted this woman, despite all he had as king, all that God had provided him with already. We're never satisfied, are we? Always coveting more other things. And let's get it straight, this is no great love story. If you've seen the Hollywood film, Gregory Peck, Susan Hayward, it's all glammed up, you know. Sounds wonderful. Well, this is simply the king demanding what he wants, regardless of what Bathsheba thinks about it. It's just a rather seedy one-night affair. In fact, what she thought of it all is not even mentioned. Not mentioned at all. In fact, it's very interesting that she's called Bathsheba at the start, then she's simply referred to as the woman. It's kind of another little bit of this story writing, just indicating that there was no concern about this woman. David had no real care for her. He didn't even know her. So he sent for her to come to him. And he must at that moment have blocked out thoughts of not doing this, thoughts of it being wrong, thoughts of God. He must have just blocked that out of his mind. We can do that, can't we? We can do that. As Christians, when it suits us, we can block out thoughts that we know, or those thoughts telling us that something we're thinking is wrong. David's attitude was simply, it's going to give me pleasure, so I'll do it right now, regardless of the longer term effects, regardless of what God might be thinking. Well, he didn't even think about that. He just didn't let himself think about that. He just wanted to do what was going to give him pleasure. And afterwards he showed no sense of remorse for what he'd done. Maybe he tried to justify things to himself. Well, it was just once. It'll be okay. That was all right. I don't know, maybe he even forgot about Bathsheba afterwards. But then, sometime later, came that devastating news. She was pregnant. All of a sudden, that changed everything. Her husband was away at war. He'd been away for a period of time. So questions were going to be asked. Now, at that point, of course, David could have owned up, couldn't he? He could have owned up to what had happened and prevented all that hurt further down the line. That would have been a hard thing to do. But he could have owned up and avoided that hurt. He missed that opportunity. He seemed to have no thought of anyone else's feelings. He just worried about himself. How he could get away with it without being found out. That's how it goes, isn't it? That's how we tend to think. When we've done something wrong, we might be found out. The panic is, how can I cover it up? So he tried to get Uriah to sleep with his wife. He went to an elaborate sort of plan to try. Has Uriah brought back from the battle? Just thinking, naturally, he'll go home to his wife and sleep with her. He won't. In fact, another bit of this story writing here is the comparison here between Uriah, the ordinary man who is seen as an amazing man of principle, versus David. We read in verse 11, Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open fields. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. What a guy, eh? He wants to do things right. Interesting, the ark is mentioned. Remember, the ark is the thing where the Ten Commandments were placed. Those commandments that David was breaking in all of this. David followed a path of lies and deceit, trying to cover things up. But the sins just multiplied. Again, that's how it happens, isn't it? If we don't own up, if we try to cover up, things just get worse. Like that hanky. We try to wash it away ourselves. It won't work. It eventually led to murder, as good as in God's eyes. And the great tragedy is that this is so contrary to all we've read about David in the past, all we've seen of him as a great man of God. It is such a powerful example of how anybody can fall if they allow temptation to get a hold. How far we too can fall if we let sinful desires, selfish desires, take a hold of us and not stop them. Still, after all it was done, he did not repent of what he'd done. He just hoped it would all blow over. And for this time, any relationship with God just seems to have evaporated. God gets a frequent mention in the narrative of David. Not here. All through this, we don't get God mentioned. Another very telling thing. That's what sin does, of course. If it's unconfessed, it distances us from God and our relationship with Him. We will not feel close to Him. So yes, if David can fall, such a great man of faith, well, so can we. We can fall into the same pattern of behaviour if we're not on our guard. especially if our faith is at that low ebb perhaps. We begin by allowing that temptation to linger in our minds. We block God out, letting those sinful, selfish desires to take hold. We maybe make one bad decision and we act on it. We refuse to acknowledge what we've done to ourselves or to anybody else. And we find ourselves doing things wrong again, repeating the wrongdoing. It's how it happens. What did God do? It seems just a very short comment at the end, but actually I think it is quite telling. We rarely find God's feelings and emotions being spoken of. So that simple statement, the thing David had done displeased God, actually is a very strong comment at the end there. And God made his displeasure known to David through the prophet Nathan. We read about that in chapter 12. What happens is Nathan is told what has happened. He knows. And he goes to see David and he tells him a story. Although David thinks it's something real he's telling him. He tells him a story about a rich man and a poor man. The rich man who has great flocks of sheep. And there's a poor man who's just got one little lamb that he owns. And he loves this little lamb and he eats with it and it's like a little child to him. The rich man has a visitor coming and he wants to give him lamb for his dinner. And he takes this little lamb from the poor man and he uses that rather than one of his own. And David's up in arms over this, said, "Who is it? Tell me who it is. This man deserves to die." And Nathan says to David, "You're that man." And at that point, God broke through the shell that David had created around himself. That's what did it. And the enormity of his sin then at last dawned on him. And he confessed to it. David said, "I have sinned." He needed to say those words so long before. But at last, at this time, he said it. "I have sinned." And God forgave him. God forgave him straight away, it seems, as we read it. David was genuinely sorry at long last. He confessed. God forgave him. There were no conditions set upon him forgiving him. We read, "The Lord has taken away your sin." Because God is gracious. He will look for ways to make us see the reality of our sin, as he did with David, and he will give us those opportunities to confess. We've got to take those opportunities, and he will always forgive us, no matter what we've done. So was it all right then? Is that where it all ends? Awful sin, God forgives David, it's all fine. Well, no, it's not all fine. It's far from being all fine, and that's as big a lesson here as anything else in this story. We need to take this one to heart as well. And as Christians, maybe we're guilty of failing to notice this other lesson sometimes as well. Because just because we're forgiven doesn't mean that sin doesn't matter. Doesn't mean that sin doesn't matter. Is that the wrong way of putting it? You know what I mean? Because the consequences of his sin still remain. And it was a serious sin, so the consequences were very serious. Bathsheba was widowed. We read, she mourned her husband. This was the husband she loved. He was dead. There was her grief and her life being ripped apart. Actually, others died with Uriah in that battle too. There were other grieving wives and children as well. Joab, who did the dirty work for David, he now had a hold on David, and it was going to be difficult in the future for David to put him right. Joab commits a murder later on in the story as we see it, and he goes unpunished, unmentioned. Well, what could David do? Joab knew what he'd done. This incident permanently damaged David's ability to rule as king with the kind of credibility and respect that he'd had before. There was no going back to where he was before. We need to see that in this story. The worst of all, perhaps, was that David had set an example of adultery and murder, which we see followed on in his own family in the next couple of generations. The same kind of things we see happening. Who was he to criticise and set them right? God will always forgive us. He will wipe away the sin, but he cannot wipe away all the consequences of our sin. And that's an important lesson from this story. God will forgive us, but if we continue to sin, we will continue to do damage to ourselves and to those around us. We'll do damage to our own faith and to our ability to share that faith credibly with others. If we continue to sin, sin matters. It's important that we put every effort into ridding ourselves of sin in our lives. When we sin, we cannot go back to where we were before. There are always consequences to our sin. What are the positive things we can learn from David? There are some. Despite this major setback to his faith and those consequences, I believe he still remained a man after God's own heart. We see evidence of that again further down the line. His faith did recover from this. God did finally reach his heart again through Nathan, as I've explained. The reality dawned. Eventually he made no excuses. He didn't try to blame others or hide it anymore from God. As well as the story here, we have David pouring all of that out in the Psalms, in Psalm 51. We're going to read it a little bit later as a prayer for ourselves. It's a wonderful psalm. It's got a little introduction saying that David wrote this on this occasion. And we see how sorry he was eventually, and how he poured it all out to God, and how that restored his relationship with God. The story of David does tell us there's a way back to God, even after the biggest of falls. And again, as I said before, we know that is all because of Jesus, that he's provided that way back to us. There's those verses in 1 John that I think maybe I often read, but they're good verses. John's writing, he says, "My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defence, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. He is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, not only for ours, but also for the sins of the world." Let's give thanks to God for that forgiveness, that wonderful forgiveness that's available to us through Jesus, our Saviour. Let's also ask for his Spirit to come and help to live within us, and help us to stop falling to temptations that lead to sin, that spoil our relationship with him, that hurt our relationships with others, and that reduce our effectiveness in living for God and witnessing to our faith. We will never be perfect. We will keep on needing that forgiveness, but we must try to be our best for God, and he will help us in that effort.